All right, now let's do our dilution series. Okay, so we have our original sample here, which is being represented by crystal violet. And then we have our tubes here. You label them, pre whatever number it is, or post whatever, and then the numbers, 10 to the minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, minus 5. This is a representation. These numbers are a representation of the proportion or the change in concentration from the original. So this is 1, or 100%, or whatever. 10 to the minus 1 is a tenth as much. 10 to the minus 2 is 1/100th. 10 to the minus 3 is 1/1000th. 10 to the minus 4 is 1/10,000th. 10 to the minus 5 is 1/100,000th. All right, so you can see really quickly in 5 tubes, we go from 1 to 100,000 times less concentrated. This is important because your original sample probably going to have a lot of bacteria in there. And we want to reduce the count to something that we can actually count on a plate. The reason we're using the crystal violet here is so that you can see how things become diluted and how quickly by the change in the color. You probably remember from staining the crystal violet, very intense purple. It seems like it will never dilute away. We're just going to see how it works here. All right, so that's the idea. Now let's go ahead and do it. Okay, so first, loosen our tubes, the tubes that we're wanting to loosen. Okay, and we're just going to do the first 2. In case we hit one of the other ones, we don't want the top popping off because remember, we want to work as aseptically as possible. All right, have your micropipetter. Make sure that you're set to 500. Go in, grab your sterile tip. Then, what do? Swirl it. Depress the plunger to the first stop. Go in. Draw slowly. And you can see there's no air bubble or anything in the tip. If you see an air bubble, just redispense back into the tube and try again. You want this to be full all the way to the tip. Now, to dispense, just like that, and then boom, the rest. Okay, so a couple of things to note here. First off, you look at that, that's not a whole lot less intense than that, right? There's not a whole lot of difference in the intensity. We can't see a difference yet. We need to dilute it more. This is analogous to the concentration of bacteria that you're working with. At 10 to the minus 1, it's still going to be too high of a concentration, which is why we are going to continue diluting it. Another thing you can see here, that there's still some here in the tip. That part of that is because crystal violet is how crystal violet is. These tips are designed to be as hydrophobic as possible to sort of help it to come off, but you're still going to have some in there. Now, because of that, even though we aren't worried so much about contamination, because these samples are all sterile, we don't want to mess up the concentration by having some residue that's there that we don't want. So, we eject the tip, we get a new tip, and we start over. Swirl it, loosen the cap, and really you should do that before you get the tip so you don't end up touching this. If you do happen to touch it, eject it, get a new one. We have plenty of these tips. Much better that than messing up your whole experiment with some contamination. All right, so we're ready. Swirl it, depress to the first stop, go in, draw slowly, make sure that you don't have any bubbles, and I'll show you what I mean here, okay? If you don't draw quickly enough, you get something like that. You can see that's clearly not right. You just eject it again. Okay, you can see that's sort of wonky as well. Sometimes that'll just happen and there's no way to avoid it. If that happens, then eject it and get a new tip. Okay, so we can see, nice and clean. Into the next one. Boom. Depress to the second stop. You can do a little bit more. Again, this isn't a huge deal, but there we go. Okay, now swirl that. And there are a couple of reasons we want to swirl this. The big one is because we want it to be evenly mixed when we dispense it to the next one, right? But also, in case you have some sample that's still stuck on the sides. Now, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are dispensing directly into the water and not to the side of the tube to make sure that that doesn't happen. You don't necessarily want to go down in because you don't want to run the risk of contaminating if your pipetter is, well, contaminated. But now we're starting to see a little bit of a difference here, right? Okay, so at 10 to the minus 2, this is 1/100th as concentrated as this is. Still pretty intense though, right? There's a lot of crystal violet in there. So we have to keep diluting. Okay, so double check, make sure that your volume is correct. Go in, draw, double check, make sure that you don't have any bubbles. Dispense, and try not to dispense onto the sides of the tube. And boom. Now you can also notice that it's not sticking as much as it did before. That's because crystal violet is weird. You're dealing with a sample that is largely water, and you can see that it behaves a lot better. We could try and get that last little bit out, but we're talking like a couple of microliters. It's not a big deal. New tip, swirl it, or shake it, or whatever it. And you can see, again, big difference between those two. 1/10 is concentrated. This is 1/1000th is concentrated as the original. And we're starting to get to something that we can actually sort of start to see through. Okay? Now, we do it again. Swirl, depress, draw slowly, double check, no bubbles. Into our next tube. And boom. Now, look at that. It's hardly even registering here on this camera. You can see a faint tinge of purple there, right? So the particles of crystal violet or whatever are rather spread out now. This is something that we're down to a concentration where it's workable, all right? But we're gonna keep going. So, new tip, double check again, we have the right volume. Okay, swirl or shake or whatever. Depress, go in, draw slowly, double check, you're good. Dispense down to the second. And boom. All right, and by this point, you can hardly see any purple at all. There's just a little bit on the left. You might be able to see it in the video, you might not. But on the right, now we're pretty much seeing nothing at the 10 to the minus 5. Now, I don't know if your water samples and the bacteria are going to be like this, but let's just go ahead and take a look here. All right, so 10 to the minus 1, very dark, it's hard to tell that there's, it's still too concentrated. 10 to the minus 2, we're getting there. It's, we're starting to be able to see through it. 10 to the minus 3, that's a very beautiful purple, can see through it. This is something we might be able to work with. 10 to the minus 4, the intensity has gone down quite a bit. 10 to the minus 5, though, there's not a whole lot there. We might not really get much by way of results. Again, this is not necessarily how your samples are going to be, but this is to illustrate how quickly you can change the concentrations and why we're doing it, and that we're sort of shooting for something in about this range, okay? And that's why you're using these many tubes for your dilution series. Now we're going to take a look at plating.